Hey guys, Chris and Ashley here with CTX Advantage Group coming to you today with more NAR talk. This time we're going to focus a little more on the listing side and how that affects those of you who might be thinking about selling your house in the future. There were some changes that happened there, and we want to talk to you about those things and make you feel a little bit more comfortable about them.
Absolutely. So if you haven't already done so, be sure and watch at least part of the buyer video that we just posted. So it should be the previous video. That piece will give you a little bit of information, just a little base knowledge there on what some of the changes were. But we're going to talk specifically in this video about the changes that sellers are going to be asking about. We're already getting questions about this, so we're going to go ahead and deal with those today and try to dispel some of those myths for you guys. So as part of this NAR settlement, there are some specific changes that, again, as we mentioned in the last video, really aren't going to change the way we do business, but it definitely shapes the way some of the media is handling some of the information. For instance, commissions have never been and probably will never be set by law. And that's something that we have to be very upfront about. There may be agents out there, and I'm assuming, with every other change that there's ever been, it's because there was evidence to the fact that that practice was happening. And so it came out in this agreement that, hey, agents are not allowed to say commissions are set by law. It's always negotiable. And it is very consistent regionally. There's a lot of areas throughout the country that are certain percentages, and while other areas are different percentages. There can even be neighborhoods that have different percentages that are customary. But again, it's always negotiable. So upfront, sellers know that. Nothing's changed there. It's never going to be set by law, and it's not set by law. The offer of compensation has to be very clear. So again, there may be agents out there just saying, you're going to pay this percentage, and we're going to go and pay the buyer agent part of that percentage. No, we actually have to separate that, and the paperwork does look different. If you're a seller, if you've sold homes in the past, you'll see a little bit different separation. Just with any paperwork change, they're highlighting the sections, they're segmenting, making sure that the language is very clear so that sellers understand, okay, if I'm paying X commission, am I paying all of that to you, Mr. Agent, if you bring the buyer? Or if somebody else brings a buyer, do I have to pay, am I paying something else? Or is the buyer paying them? Let's segment that out. And that's how it's done in the paperwork. Is it requiring that the buyer pay their own agent? Not necessarily. The language, and of course some of the media will put that out there that, oh, sellers certainly don't have to pay commission anymore. They've never had to. And that's going to be the case moving forward. You don't have to pay a buyer agent commission. Okay, so don't let the media twist it to make it seem like that's what you were required to do before. Practically, there may have been agents that required that or made you or led you to believe that it was required, but in reality, that's not the case. You're not required to compensate a buyer's agent, and that's true from before. The other piece of this agreement is that the agents must disclose and obtain your approval, seller approval, of any compensation to the buyer agent. Okay, again, this hasn't changed. If we're going to pay the buyer agent, if we're going to make that offer of compensation, we're going to let you know. We always have that part of the commission that we negotiate is going to pay a buyer agent. Now, I'm going to dive into some of the questions that we're getting, which, of course, the very first one is, hey, it sounds like I'm going to make more money on my house because I don't have to pay a buyer agent anymore. Again, you are more than welcome to do that. You're not required, as we just discussed, to pay a buyer agent. But what happens is, even though now nothing is on the MLS, agents don't know, what happens is, practically, the agents are going to call. So if I'm representing 100 Main Street and the seller has decided they're not going to pay a buyer agent, and they call me, an agent who has an interested buyer calls me, I'm going to pick up the phone and they're going to ask, are y'all paying a buyer agent commission? I'll have to say no. what's going to happen, Chris? What are you going to have to tell your buyer at that point? What does that conversation look like?
Well, the problem there is that I go back to my buyer and I tell my buyer that the seller is not paying a commission on that. And so now the buyer has to decide, do they want to move forward on that house? Because no one's going to work for free. And our clients that work with us would never expect for me to work for free. And so are they in a position to want to pursue that house and pay a buyer agent commission? And so you can see where it could cause some problems if you are unwilling to pay, especially if everyone else around you is paying a buyer agent commission.
Sure. What do you think? So let's say that it was a very unique house overlooking a bluff, 1 in a million views, and the seller's not paying a commission. What does that look like on the buy side then? What are they trying to wrestle with, and what do you think the ultimate outcome would be if that buyer really wanted to move forward on that?
I think that's a great question. I also think it's probably going to be unique to the buyer and their situation. I certainly think that we work with buyers that would say things like, don't worry about it, we'll put your compensation in the agreement and we're going to move forward because we really want the house. But I also think that there would be buyers that would want to find ways to be creative with our offer and whatever agreement we could come to that would still allow them to purchase the house and the seller to feel like they're getting a good deal, but essentially the sellers still pay compensation. It's really a line item.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was leading you, right? Ultimately, in any contract, there's a lot of terms. All the terms are negotiable ultimately. And what we haven't seen historically in certain markets is the use of the seller paid closing costs, right? And so that line, I have a feeling we're going to start seeing that used at a high level for sellers who are saying, hey, I've got a great house, I don't need to pay a buyer's agent commission. Well, you can almost expect that, okay, I'm not going to do that. How about we do this? I'll pay you your asking price, but then I'm going to have you pay closing costs equal to my buyer's agent compensation. So I don't see this really changing the way we do business. The language is going to change. You're going to hear a lot of media. You're probably even going to have agents walk in your door and say, that's right, you don't have to pay a buyer agent. You should work with me because you're going to make more money on your house. The reality is either buyers are going to avoid your house if you don't have a 1 in a million home. I know a lot of sellers do think that their home is 1 in a million, but
most sellers think so.
Most sellers probably think that. But in reality, it's 1 in a million to you. But you have to remember, buyers don't always see it the way you see it. So ultimately, what will happen is sellers, what we will recommend is that you still offer broker compensation for the buyer agent because one way or another, it's going to come up in the contract or an offer if you say no. So I think it just makes more sense and probably keep everybody, increase your market share, so to speak, by offering that compensation up front and not trying to eliminate that and potentially make yourself more money. I think ultimately, we've talked about this before, that anything that detracts from showings, and this could certainly qualify, could lead to a lower market price.
Sure.
Or rather a lower selling price.
Well, and I've got a question for you that I've had posed to me. Why couldn't we just say that you were asking $600,000 for your house? Why couldn't we just put $620,000 and then $20,000 for the buyer agent? That way I still get my money as the seller, and we're just tacking on the buyer agent commission to the price of the house. Why can't we just do that?
Well, that's a problem, obviously, and the big problem with that is appraisals, right? And unless somebody down the street and 5 other homes in the neighborhood had done that and somehow managed to do it with cash, an appraiser is not going to be able to get there. You have to have an appraisal if you're using financing, and the appraiser uses the comparables that have sold before you. And if all of those comparables that sold before you sold with buyer agent compensation, then they're not going to be able to tack that on to the sales price in order to create value that's not there just because of the compensation. So you might be able to get under contract that way, But I think what's going to happen is 3 weeks in, when the appraisal comes back, is everybody's going to be angry. Seller's going to be angry because the appraiser was only able to get to 600. The buyer is going to be upset because they only got to 600. And if we're doing our job, not that we would ever recommend a buyer do that, but we would probably be in the appraiser's ear if we could meet him at the house and say, hey, this is the way we did this to try to create value. They're not going to care.
No.
They're not going to care. So that tactic is going to fail miserably and just create a dead transaction,
yeah.
I think, in the end, because the seller's going to be upset and may not negotiate. And really, your only result there is you either terminate the agreement because the appraisal came in short or renegotiate. And I know sellers get pretty upset at that point, and nobody wants to renegotiate just because the appraisal came in low because of broker compensation. So, yeah, any other questions that we're getting? So, again, that major question that we're getting is, do I even have to pay a buyer agent? I think the other question that I've heard is, what are the risks of not paying? And I think we've covered that just in this last example. The risk is you're going to have agents that are going to call and say, are you offering buyer agent compensation? You say no. They'll tell their buyer, and the buyer will potentially rule out your house. So we don't want that to happen to you. So we'll have that conversation. And of course, we're going to keep track of what happened and what the trends are in the marketplace, because we're too early. We're 2.5 weeks into this settlement agreement. So a lot of things may change practically, but the way the agreement is written, nothing really changes other than to just create more transparency.
Yeah. And that's what we want in the transaction anyways. I think that, as long as both sides know what's going on and, the agents are being transparent, then our goal on both sides, whether we're talking about buyers or sellers, is to get to the finish line. The seller wants to sell the home and move on to the next project, and the buyer obviously is looking for that next home to move their family into. So, both sides are working toward a common goal, and so transparency will always be a good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for this and other topics, tune in. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube. And be on the lookout for future informational videos that can help you navigate this market moving forward. I know the next one we're excited about doing is to talk about the interest rates. Yeah. Everybody's kind of heard about the interest rates and how they may be changing. We're in September now, September 24, if you're catching this later. So we're expecting some rate changes, and I think it's going to be important for you to tune in, especially buyers, to see how that's likely to change moving forward. The marketplace, and what that might ultimately create in competition. Yeah. So stay tuned, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.